Yes, I'm Lawrence Ryan, and not surprisingly, I come from Cowra. And I'm pretty proud about my town, and I'm very proud about what we have in Cowra that's unique, and that is a story that is a tragic World War II story, but has a very positive outcome. Now, there's going to be plenty of opportunities to talk at the end of the presentation, so if you've got questions, don't be afraid to ask, but I'll just go through it now, and hopefully you'll learn something a little bit different about the Cowra story, and not just concentrating on the breakout itself. That being said, my first image, of course, is the Cowra prisoner of war camp, camp number 12, on the day, or either the afternoon of the breakout or the day after, so the 5th or 6th of August 1944. And the reason we know that is you can see the Japanese compound in the camp here, B compound, and you can also see that there's a number of missing huts here, and that's because there's only 3 of the 21 sleeping huts left. The rest have been burnt. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get on to the story of the Cowra prisoner of war breakout. Saturday the 5th of August 1944, which I would say is Cowra's most infamous day. The largest prisoner of war breakout in modern military history, and also the only land battle fought on Australian soil during the Second World War. Became known as the Cowra breakout. The facts, you've probably heard these plenty of times before. 1,104 Japanese prisoners of war attempted a mass breakout from number 12 prisoner of war camp Cowra. Now, one question I often get, Cowra's number 12, any ideas how many prisoner of war camps there were and internment camps in Australia during the Second World War? 28. So Cowra was number 12. It's an interesting story. There was a decision had to be made, and they were going to build a prisoner of war camp in central west New South Wales to hold Italian prisoners of war who were being captured in very large numbers in North Africa. So there was a decision made that it would be in either Cowra, Tamworth, Dubbo or Bathurst. And they inspected all the sites. They selected Cowra in May 1941, and in June 1941 they had people on site already living in the camp in compounds in tents. So it didn't take long in the war years to get things to happen. I work for Cowra Council, so you can imagine how long it would take to get something like that done these days. During the breakout, 234 Japanese are killed or die by their own hand. 107 are wounded, and a further three POWs die subsequently of the wounds. So that's what gives us our number of 234. 234 because 231 die within the 9 days of the breakout. The other 3 die of their wounds in hospital up to 3 months later. So that's why we go 234 as a number. 334 Japanese POWs escape into the surrounding countryside, and they are recaptured over the ensuing 9 days. From the Australian point of view, 3 Australian privates are killed during the breakout: Hardy, Jones and Shepherd. 8 Australian servicemen are wounded by what would today be called friendly fire. Interestingly, the 3 privates, 2 of those, Hardy and Jones, are subsequently awarded the George Cross posthumously for gallantry against the fanatical Japanese. The interesting thing was people said they should get the Victoria Cross, but the argument was that at the time it was a military prison insurrection and it wasn't seen as a war zone. Subsequently it was, but they'd already been awarded the George Cross. So they wouldn't take away the George Cross, which would diminish that award and change it to the Victoria Cross. So 8 Australian servicemen are wounded by what would today be called friendly fire. So ricocheting bullets primarily bouncing off the asphalt road of Broadway, the main road through the prisoner of war camp, and hitting Australian service personnel. A lieutenant from the nearby military training camp, Harry Doncaster, is killed late on the 5th of August 1944 while searching for Japanese on the Cowra Road about 7 kilometres north of Cowra. And if you go down to Cowra, you'll see on that Cowra Road coming in on the right hand side, there's a memorial there to Harry Doncaster. And a sergeant, Thomas Roy Hancock from the 26th Battalion Volunteer Defence Corps at Blaney dies on the 16th of August 1944 from accidental wounds. He was being sent out with a group from the Volunteer Defence Corps at Blaney. They had to go and guard Carcoar Railway Tunnel because they were afraid that the Japanese, who were spreading out in every direction from Cowra, might come to Carcoar, see the tunnel there, disable it, and that would stop the railway line from operating. So he was climbing into the back of a an army truck to go out to Carcoar, which is from Blaney about 15 kilometres, and he climbed up into the truck, and the young fellow behind him had his rifle, didn't have the safety on it, it discharged and it shot Thomas Roy Hancock. So that's a very sad story, that one as well. So, I always say it's Cowra's darkest day, the breakout. It's a tragic event, and it could easily have been relegated to the history books. You know, there was many, many tragic events during the Second World War, and the Cowra breakout, in numbers, isn't that large, even though to us, because it is the largest military breakout, it becomes something of a great and historical story for Cowra. But something happened in Cowra that made this event really the trigger for something that was quite remarkable. And I'm going to go through that probably in more detail today than I have about the breakout. Would there be a Cowra-Japan relationship without the breakout? The answer is no. Italian POWs and internees always outnumbered Japanese POWs within the camp. Now, I mentioned Italian internees. They were only there for about 6 months. There were such large numbers of Italians coming in, and the camp was built to house Italians. So it was always going to be an Italian camp until the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and then we had another Axis power. So to give you an idea, at any given stage we had a minimum of around about 3,000 Italians, and after the end of the war, when they were bringing all the Italians back into central locations before they repatriated them back to Italy, Cowra was holding 5,000 Italian prisoners of war. There were many other Asian prisoners and detainees. They came from the Dutch East Indies, China, Formosa, Thailand, Malaysia and Korea. Quite interesting stories. The Dutch East Indies is a story in its own right. That's modern day Indonesia, of course. And what happened was that there was Indonesian independence fighters who wanted to get away from the colonial rule that they'd had for 400 years in the Dutch East Indies. And what they wanted to do, they wanted to have a free Indonesia. And the Dutch exiled them in 1928 to West Papua, to a place called Bogan Diggle, described as hell on earth actually. And when the Japanese came down through the Malay Peninsula in Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies government was frightened that these people, many of whom were intellectuals or bureaucrats, would be selected as a puppet government under the Japanese. And so what happened was, they said to the Australian government, we need to get these people who have been held in concentration camps out of West Papua, we need to get them into Australia. And so what happened, the Australian government took them to a prisoner of war camp, that was Cowra, and when they arrived, 55% of them were children. So it was an interesting story. There was a great kerfuffle about the fact that these people weren't actually prisoners of war, they were political prisoners, and they were subsequently released into the Australian community. Some went up to Mackay in North Queensland, others went down to Melbourne, and when the end of the war came, the Dutch said, right, you can repatriate these people as per the Geneva Convention to their country of origin, which is West Papua. And the Australian government said no, because their passports say they're Javanese, they can go back to Java. And they did, they sent them back to Java, where many of them did become members of the Free Indonesia movement, and so subsequently went on to become Indonesian freedom fighters in the war against the Dutch East Indies. So would Cowra POW camp be remembered at all if it wasn't for what happened after the breakout? And I've got a few examples of what we have regarding the other countries. So we have 2 memorials to Italians in Cowra. This one in Kendall Street, I think it's a lovely memorial, shows 2 hands shaking there, and it says, may we never forget the price of peace. Both of these were erected by expat Italian communities in Australia. And this one, this was taken in 2024. It shows the Italian ambassador, defence attaché and diplomats at the Cowra prisoner of war campsite with the other memorial, and it's in memory of all Italian soldiers who died in battle. So we do get quite a number of Italians coming to Cowra. We also, the Japanese war cemetery is well known, the Australian war cemetery is well known, but we also have an Indonesian war cemetery, and that's where the Indonesians who died in Cowra, who would go on to become known as freedom fighters, are buried. And they come every second year to Cowra. They're planning to do it every year in the future. and they have ceremonies there that honour these people. And you can see that's last year's ceremony. And you can see the Mayor of Cowra, Paul Smith, just there. That's the Indonesian ambassador there, plus many, many military officials that you can see, including this fellow who turned out to be the head of the Indonesian secret police. And somebody said to me, he said, if you want somebody to disappear, he's the fellow you talk to. But it's what happened to the Japanese that made the story of Cowra so famous and unique. And this is an interesting one. This is the first acts of reconciliation that we saw with the Japanese. So this is in the middle of the Second World War. Japanese prisoners of war laying flowers at the graves. Now this is quite soon after the breakout had occurred. So you can see the Australian military personnel there, and you can see 2 Japanese laying wreaths on their graves. Another famous story, what happened with the Japanese who turned up at properties around the town. And the Japanese were told once they got outside the camp that they weren't to attack civilians at all. The only civilian that they attacked was a fellow by the name of Alf Burke, who was a railway guard. Now Alf was out shooting rabbits with his son, but he had his railway coat on. So some of you might remember the old railway guards on the trains used to wear long blue coats during winter with epaulettes on the sleeve. So they would have seen that Alf and thought he was a military personnel. They surrounded him, he and his son, and he actually shot 2 of the Japanese prisoners of war. But this is a famous story. You can see a lady's face in profile there. She's got a jug there, and you've got 2 Japanese prisoners of war. That's Mrs. May Weir. Now, Mrs. Weir had 2 lots of Japanese turn up at her property. On the 5th of August, the property Rosedale, which was located around about 8 kilometres from the prisoner of war camp, 3 Japanese turned up and asked for food. Mrs. Weir called them up, got them to sit on a veranda and gave them tea and scones. She always used this little jug. And so they came, she rang the military police, they came and caught them. 9 days later, 2 of the last prisoners of war to be caught during the breakout turn up again at the property. And they're loaded on the truck here ready to go, but before she would let them go back to the camp, Mrs. Weir stopped the truck and gave them a cup of tea and scones. So it was an interesting story because it sort of influenced, now that jug there is still part of the collection of the Cowra Breakout Association, and I was going to bring it down, but it is so fragile. My wife, who's up the back there taking a photo, said to me, no, don't break it, take it, it'll fall to pieces, and we have to get it conserved. But I did include a photo of Bruce and Margaret Weir, Mrs. May Weir's children, who were there on the day of the breakout, with the jug. Now, the interesting thing was that Bruce and Margaret never married. They lived on the property Rosedale for the rest of their lives. It was quite a successful farming business. And they almost treated their mother's story as if it was this holy thing that they peace and reconciliation and understanding with enemies. And so what happened was, when they passed away, they had no family. They left all their funds, including the proceeds from the sale of Rosedale, the property, to the town of Cowra for the benefit of the Cowra community, looking at things culture, youth, peace, reconciliation. So that was a great story, that something of great good that is an ongoing benefit to Cowra occurred because of the simple act of kindness by Mrs. May Weir. And that jug is a physical link between Cowra and the Weir family. After the war, the returning Cowra RSL sub-branch members took on the task of looking after the Japanese war graves. This is where the whole thing changes. All of a sudden, the graves which were unkept, the local fellows who have been demobilised come back to Cowra. Many of them have fought against the Japanese, and they start looking after the graves because it's the right thing to do. Pretty big call when you think how hated the Japanese were at that time. Okay, so this is pretty wordy, but I can sort of summarise it for you. The work on the graves was led by a warrant officer, Ab Oliver. In 1948 he became president of the sub-branch. While fighting against the Germans and the Italians in North Africa, he'd seen the Australian war graves from the First World War that were left in Palestine, in Gaza actually, as it is today. And he was so moved by the respect that as he called them, the Arabs showed to the graves of the Australians, that he came back to Cowra and he'd fought against the Japanese in New Guinea and in Borneo. And he saw the graves of the prisoners of war here and he said, we must look after these graves because it's the right thing to do. And that's Ab Oliver. He was I describe him as a soldier and a statesman. He was as well as being the president of the RSL sub-branch, he was the Cowra Municipal Council Mayor from 63, 69, 75 to 76, and the Cowra Shire Council President from 81 to 85. So he's responsible more than anyone else for the Cowra breakout story becoming well known for its story of reconciliation. This is a very interesting clip that I paper clipping I found. Who can remember column 8 in the Sydney Morning Herald? This one I always show because we know by 1950, and for those of you who are up the back you might not be able to see it clearly, I'll read it out. A colleague just back from a visit to the war graves at Cowra tells me that besides Australians, about 300 Japanese prisoners of war are buried there. All the graves are kept in splendid order by the Cowra members of the RSL, which includes men who are prisoners of Japan. So it's a pretty big call from the members of the Cowra RSL sub-branch. It almost brings a lump to your throat when you think about it, what these fellows had endured and what they did simply because they said it was the right thing to do. Now, the Japanese consulate re-established diplomatic relations with Australia in 1956 and they come down to have a look. They expect it to be like everywhere else where the Japanese graves are left unkept. But what they find is the Cowra War Cemetery. And I describe it as a place where all receive equal respect. And the interesting thing is you can still, while there's been significant work done at the cemeteries, where these graves are here, you can still look and see the similar layout today. Just interestingly, over the last 3 months, this war cemetery has been closed simply because it's been completely refurbished. The Office of War Graves is paying around about $500,000 to upgrade it, so it looks very, very good at the moment. That's what it looks like on a typical commemoration. That's our 75th anniversary. So what happens is, and I say the Australian and Japanese cemeteries are side by side and they're remembered annually and equally. So for every wreath that's laid in the Australian cemetery, a matching wreath is laid in the Japanese cemetery. Now I've been involved with those commemorations as chair or secretary of the major commemorations right through from the 60th anniversary in 2004. Now, as you can see, that was in 2019 for the 75th anniversary. For the 80th anniversary in 2024, we had 46 wreaths laid in both cemeteries. You think it's never going to end, but it does. I was halfway, the ceremony in the Australian cemetery which is an RSL cemetery. The fellow who has done it for many, many years, a chap by the name of Tony Mooney, he looked at me about halfway through the wreath lanes and he says, my back's given out. Can you take over? And I said, I haven't practiced any of these Japanese names. So he said, you'll be all right. So yeah, so I had to do half of the graves in the Australian cemetery and then half of the graves in the, half of the wreaths in the Japanese cemetery, calling them up with their names. So yeah, so you can see that it's quite an impressive thing when you have all the wreaths laid. So, officially opened on the 5th of August 1964, the Cowra Japanese War Cemetery. I would describe it as Cowra and perhaps Australia's greatest example of reconciliation with a former enemy. And that's the entrance to the Japanese War Cemetery. It's ironic, I always think, that is such a popular spot for wedding photos during the autumn, the spring and autumn when the leaves are changing, but certainly when the blossoms are out, it's a very popular spot for weddings. Now, the war graves are cared for in perpetuity by the Department of Veterans Affairs through the Office of Australian War Graves on behalf of the Japanese government. And over the years, we have had many, many official guests come there. These are just a few that I thought I'd mention to you. Governor-General Sir Peter Cosgrove and Lady Cosgrove, that was in September 2016, with then Mayor of Cowra, Councillor Bill West. Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister, and the Honourable Michael McCormack, Member for Riverina, and the Cowra Cadet Corps members in August 2024. And perhaps most surprisingly, how many people here have ever heard of the Japanese imperial family visiting Australia? Simply they don't do it officially, except in one location. And there we have His Royal Highness Crown Prince Akihito and Princess Michiko of Japan, 9th of May 1973. He became Emperor Akihito and Empress Michiko. Now the interesting thing was when he resigned from the or abdicated from the emperor's role and became the emeritus emperor, he, in his speech, formal speech, declared Cowra as a place where he had seen reconciliation with the Japanese that he'd seen nowhere else. So that's an interesting one. A friend of mine, Graham Apthorpe, Graham and I have sort of run the Breakout Association in Cowra for many, many years. And Graham has written a number of books about the Breakout and the stories around Cowra's military history. And what Graham did, he said, the ambassador, we were having one of our commemorations, and the ambassador said, "Can I get you to autograph a copy of your new book? One for me." And he said, "Could you do one and mark it out to the Emperor?" And Graham said, "What?" And he said, "Yes, the Emperor has a great interest in what happens in Cowra." So, and there's proof, the fact that the Emperor's been there. If you go to the war cemeteries, walk around and have a look wherever there is a bronze plaque. And that bronze plaque shows you where the Japanese have been. Okay, in the early 1970s, the Cowra Tourist Development Corporation wanted to promote reconciliation and the relationship with Japan, but not have a direct reference to World War II. So they decided to build a Japanese strolling garden. It opened in 1979. It has around about 40,000 visitors per year come to the Japanese garden. Who's been to the Japanese garden in Cowra? Yeah, it's one of the most beautiful gardens you'll ever see. A magnificent garden and one of the world's great examples of reconciliation. And the reason it's built and the reason it's designed like it is, it's a garden that pays tribute to all people who died during the Second World War, and that was very clearly brought out by the designer of the Japanese garden, Ken Nakajima. He said he wanted a place where you could feel welcome whether you were Japanese or Australian, and it kept a Japanese Zen belief. He found two rocks there, one flat rock where the spirits of the Australians and the Japanese could come to rest, and another tall standing rock which was a place where the spirits could be looked over by the guardian of the gardens, whatever religion you believed in. He said that represented in Japanese Buddhism a guardian, and he said you could see that it could be a Christian angel overlooking them or a Shinto god looking after them as well. Seikei exchange program. A lot of schools and towns have exchange programs. We've had one that goes back to 1970, and that was with Seikei High School in Japan, and the local high school, the Cowra High and St Raphael's Catholic School, have a relationship with the Seikei High School in Tokyo where they have exchanges. And who organised it? By the then Mayor of Cowra, Ab Oliver. Mr Oliver, the same Cowra ex-serviceman who began the work of tending the Japanese war graves at the end of the Second World War. And it's been in operation continuously from 1970, and there's a quote from Ab Oliver, and I'll read it out for anyone who can't see it down the back. "We thought the finest way to heal the wounds with our own old foes was to get the youth together to talk to each other, then the older people would come down to that sort of thinking too." A.J. Oliver, MBE. Core Farmer Choir is the male voice choir from Tokyo Agricultural University. It was formed in 1967. They do a goodwill tour to Australia and New Zealand every second year. They first visited Cowra in 1977, and this year's tour, which is always on a Sunday, so you can come down and hear them. They're just a magnificent choir, will be their 23rd visit to Cowra. And they tour, when they tour, they come to Sydney, Adelaide, Auckland, Wellington and Cowra. So it's quite a special event as well. Cowra's World Peace Bell. Who's seen the Peace Bell at Cowra? Yeah, a few of you. 23 of them worldwide. They're made of coins and medals that are donated by members of the United Nations to the World Peace Bell Association. The World Peace Bell Association then recast them as enormous bells. Our bell weighs 477 kilos, and it contains coins and medals from 65 member nations of the United Nations. Now, over 100 nations donate coins and medals to the World Peace Bell Association for use in casting of these bells. Now, I know it weighs 477 kilos, not because I tried to lift it, but because I had a tour group through about 2 years ago now of high school students, and they were all Year 12 students, and they said, oh, we don't believe it's 477 kilos. And I said, well, it is. I said, you can't lift it. So about 4 of them, 5 of them got around the bell and lifted it. They lifted it about yay high, and then instead of lowering it back down, they dropped it. So I'm under there with the school group, and that's a timber Japanese structure, and it shook and it rattled and it rolled, but it's still there. So I've got to say, I was a bit worried though when they decided to let it drop. And Claire, the Cowra girl at the visitor centre, who's seen the hologram at the Cowra visitor centre? Yeah, it's worth having a look at. The creators, the Shirley Spectre group in Sydney, said, we will give you an attraction that never ages. And it doesn't age. It is as good now as when it was installed back in 1998. I've worked at the visitor centre as the manager at one stage, but now I still work on weekends. I could tell you the whole script of the hologram. I could actually probably do that as a presentation, but that'll be for another occasion. But it gets people in there, and the numbers at the visitor centre was 25,000 per year until that went in. And then all of a sudden, Bill Bryson came to Australia to write Bryson Down Under. Came to Cowra, watched it 3 times, and came out and he said, that's very good. And the young lady then who was in charge of the visitor centre on the day, Kelly Dunlop, said, yeah, it's good, eh? And I know Kelly because that's exactly how she's speaking. He put in the book. He said, I came out, spoke to the girl and said, it's good, eh? And he said, but it's good because he said, it's a tourist attraction that could match anything that goes on in Disneyland in a country town that reminded him of America in the 1950s. So that was a pretty good saying. And the Cowra Peace Precinct, which was and still is an ambitious plan by Cowra Council to include the POW campsite as part of the Cowra's premier passive recreation area. So that's what it looked like. And I haven't gone through chapter and verse and taking photos of what it looks like today, other than one. And that's to show one of the 2 water reservoirs. We have 2 enormous water reservoirs up there at Cowra Peace Precinct overlooking the POW camp. That's the smaller one. It's only a 1 million gallon reservoir. The big one is 1.5 million gallons. But that one, what it shows is a group of young Cowra students, one who's drawn a picture of the World Peace Bell overlooking a black and white photo of the prisoner of war camp. And around this side is the national flowers of every country who was involved with the prisoner of war camp. So it's got Australian wattle, it's got the Japanese chrysanthemums, it's got all the flowers from the other nations who were there. So, Cowra story is known worldwide. There's a mention of it in a number of locations. Of course, one of the most famous is in Japan. And of course, we have connections with Japan that extend right across Japan. That's why we don't have a sister city relationship with any place in Japan, because people who were held at the Cowra prisoner of war camp came from all over that country. But one place in particular took an interest in what had happened. Who saw a movie done by Angelina Jolie called Unbroken? We looked at the story of Louis Zamparelli, an American prisoner of war. He'd been an Olympic runner, and he was sent to a prisoner of war camp called Noetsu. It was the most brutal of the Japanese prisoner of war camps. 58 Allied prisoners of war died at the Noetsu camp because of poor conditions, sanitation, food and so on. 8 of the Japanese guards who were there were executed as Class B war criminals. So it's quite a sad story. The people from Noetsu, or Joetsu City as it had become, it combined 3 different locations to become Joetsu City, came to Cowra and saw what had happened. A Cowra person who had died there at the camp, his family had gone up to Noetsu, and Tony Mooney, who I mentioned previously from the RSL sub-branch, had gone up there and conducted a ceremony in memory of the prisoners of war. So a group of people came from Joetsu City. They had a look at what had happened here at Cowra, and they decided to purchase part of the Noetsu prisoner of war camp, and they converted it into a peace park. And so it's like a rite of passage. If you go from Cowra to Japan, you go to Joetsu. and my wife will confirm that when you turn up on the train at Juetsu, the platform is lined by Japanese people, from school children up to elderly people, waving Australian flags. And it's quite an interesting feeling to see that. That's 2004. I had dark hair in those days. It was quite a cool day, as you can see, at Juetsu. But you can imagine what the conditions were like. The Australian and the Allied prisoners of war were housed in basically a big tin shed that had been used as a salt store. And they had to run from that salt store about a mile to the steelworks where they worked. So it was a pretty harsh place. But this is the memorial at Juetsu, and it's got two angels flying over it. And if you ever go there, the Japanese will say, what do those angels represent? And you find out that one of them, this one here, has a floral wreath around her head with chrysanthemums. This one has a floral wreath around her head with wattle. So that's how you can tell which is which. So Cowra people go there all the time if there's a visit there, and it's always held with great pomp and ceremony. So, Saturday the 5th of August may well be Cowra's most famous day, but if you concentrate on that one day only, you only see the military side of the story. The prisoner of war breakout, the largest military breakout in history. 1,104 people breaking out from the prisoner of war camp. 234 of them killed, 107 wounded. 334 all wandering through the district of Cowra for 9 days until they were recaptured. But it's more important to look, I think, at what happened, why the RSL story has such a resonant development of what had happened. And you've got to give full contribution to the town's respect for the ideals of peace, respect and international understanding. But always remember this, it's the RSL sub-branch at Cowra that had that decision to look after the graves because they said it was the right thing to do. And they didn't really know what they were doing at the time other than showing respect to the graves, but to the Japanese it made a difference. And that difference was they saw prisoners of war as having no honour, whether they were Allied or whether they were Japanese. They were seen as having no honour. And so as a result, the Japanese who were there lived in this constant fear of their families being found out as having a son who was a prisoner of war. We didn't know it at the time, but what happened was that the fact that the local sub-branch members, the men who beat Japan in battle, came back, found the graves, looked after those graves, the honour of those Japanese who had been seen as having no honour, all of a sudden the people of Japan saw at Cowra 234 honourable men who had died and been shown respect by the people who beat them in battle. So that's the story of Cowra, more importantly than anything else. Or the wonderful spirit of reconciliation and international understanding that's developed since 1945, really important to think of that. Japanese garden, the guard tower out at the prisoner of war campsite, they're all things that add to that story. But that's the most important of all, the Japanese war cemetery. No war cemetery, no maintenance of that, no Cowra-Japan relationship. And I always say it's a spirit of understanding and respect that still goes forth to this day. So this is an interesting photograph. 50th anniversary of the Breakout, 1994. Sergeant Major Masuro Mariki, captured in New Guinea. Private Wal Mackenzie, member of the 26th Garrison Battalion at Cowra, came from Canamble, so not that far from here. Side by side, on the day of the Breakout, they were also very close together. Wal was on one side of the main gates of Broadway. Masuro Mariki was on the other side of those gates. Wal was firing at point-blank range into the Japanese who were trying to get over there. Masuro Mariki was one of those men armed with a baseball bat with nails in it and with a glove on to climb over the barbed wire. It's better to see them at the Japanese garden like that than thinking what they'd been doing in 1944. And I finished the presentation with this quote made in the Cowra Japanese War Cemetery on the 4th of August 2024 with the Prime Minister. The people of Cowra remind us that no matter what our common humanity has, the power to transcend, that common humanity has the power to transcend everything. In the wake of the bleakest of nights, Cowra took the ashes of war and tenderly and carefully nourished the roots of friendship. It's a friendship between Australia and Japan that grows and flourishes today. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen.